The Historic Property Grant Program, we're in our FY 2020 grant cycle now. We've got a total of $300,000 to award this year from the Planning Board. The money is from the Prince George's County Planning Board, and the Planning Department just administers the program for them. So they make the ultimate decision over who gets the funding. And they've got $300,000 to give away this year. The maximum award per property is $50,000. It's a competitive program, and we generally have more demand than we can fully fund. So typically what happens is you may get a little less than $50,000 if that's what you apply for, but we encourage people to apply for as much as they can use, and then just be prepared to maybe not get quite as much. Really quickly, I wanted to just go through the packets, which you've all had a chance to look at now. What they contain are a set of grant application instructions, which is one of the white double-sided pieces of information. Then the application itself, which is the next set of white paper. And that application can also be downloaded online. If you go to our website and you want to fill it in electronically, we do have a fillable version of that. And there's a sample grant contract, which is on the pink paper. And that is the contract that you would sign if you are selected to receive a grant, which sort of lays out the timeline, time of performance, and responsibilities of you as a grantee in the program. And then we've got a sample easement on the yellow paper, because all grants that are awarded, the sort of contingency for them is to grant MNC-PPC a historic preservation easement. So that's just a sample document that includes the basic kind of protections that our easements typically include, though they are ultimately done sort of tailored to each individual property by our legal staff. And then the green packet, is a easement Q&A that kind of goes into more of what the easement entails. So if you want to not read through all the legalese of the sample easement, that gives you the basics of it. But you do kind of have that boilerplate language to look over as well to see if it's something you would be comfortable with before applying. So in terms of what properties are eligible, you've got to be located in Prince George's County. And to apply for the grant program, you can either be a designated county historic site, a property individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or a contributing property in a local or National Register Historic District. To ultimately receive the funding, you have to be a designated county historic site. So you don't have to be one to apply. If you're not yet designated as a historic site, but you're interested in the program, you can certainly apply if you meet one of the other eligibility criteria. Those are the main eligible properties. And if you have any questions about the differences between these types of things, let me know, and I'm happy to clarify. But for our purposes, ultimately you need to be an individual county historic site, to get the money. So that's sort of the end game, even if you aren't one yet. Individual applicants include individual property owners, nonprofit property owners, including religious organizations, and incorporated municipalities, which is how the Bostwick House was able to get funding, being owned by the town of Bladensburg, for example. And speaking of Bostwick, that's the buttress on the left there, which has not been grant funded yet, but we did do some funding to stabilize it. But it is stabilized now. There's a big steel support up that's kind of keeping that wall up in place of the buttress, and the plan is to have it deconstructed, carefully documented, and then reconstructed as it was originally built, which will be several rounds of funding to get all that done.
It's really is structural.
Oh yes.
Okay.
I mean, it's really, there's a lot of stuff going on with that property, but the buttress was kind of propping it up to a great degree. So the purpose of the grant program, which you've all probably figured out by now, is the protection, preservation, and enhancement of Prince George's County historic sites. And as I mentioned before, there's a $50,000 grant limit per property. These are some of the major contract conditions that you'll find, if you get to that point of being funded. So one, as I mentioned before, you have to be designated as a county historic site. Two, all of the grant-funded work has to comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards, which are included, I think, they're either in the grant contract as the last page, or they're in the easement. And if they're not in either of those, I can certainly provide you with a copy of them. But they're not very rigid. They're sort of general rules of what's appropriate, and they're interpreted by preservation professionals and contractors and things like that. So you've got a fair amount of latitude within them, but everything has to adhere to them. There's also the 10% required match, which the grantee must provide. So in the case of a $50,000 grant, you would have to provide at least $5,000 of your own resources. It doesn't necessarily have to be cash. It can be in kind, or it can be materials. So if you have $5,000 worth of paint, or something like that, you can certainly count that towards your match. So the 10% match, which I mentioned, the donation of the easement, which there's a little bit more on that towards the end of the presentation, so I won't dwell on that too much. And it's also important to note that grant funds are only issued as reimbursements for completed work. So we don't pay the contractors directly or anything like that. You do have to, in addition to the match funds that you're responsible for, you do have to sort of have that full $50,000 or whatever your grant request is up front to pay your contractor. And then once you submit your reimbursement request to us, we try to get it back to you within 30 days. And I say the $50,000, but you don't have to wait until the project's completely done to get a reimbursement. So if you've got a $50,000 grant and your project's worth $55,000 in total because you've got your match in there, and you're doing an exterior rehabilitation, and you've got a contractor who's willing to, maybe once a month bill you for $2,000 or $3,000 or something like that over the course of several months, we can definitely reimburse you on a monthly basis.
Just out of curiosity, what if the contractor is willing to finance the project, and the project is completed? You haven't paid off the financing yet, but the project is completed and it's on a finance arrangement with them. Would you get paid in that situation?
We typically
pay off
the way that our guidelines are written for the reimbursements is that we have to have documentation of payment. So we usually have to have an invoice that shows a proof of payment.
But in that case, I would think that the financing would probably pay the contractor. So the contractor would be considered resolved, and then it would just be the loan that was unresolved.
I don't think it's ever come up. I mean, so I'm not sure. Number 6, the grant awards may be taxable. We do issue.
1099.
Yeah, you register as a vendor with the commission. Once you sign one of these grant contracts, you're given a vendor number. And when the commission gives you your reimbursements for having paid your contractors, it comes to you, and then at the end of the year, you're issued a 1099, which is similar to what you would get if you were doing contract work for an organization. So it does kind of come in looking like income. We can't offer tax advice to people, so if it's something you're concerned about, definitely consult with a tax professional. Really quickly, if you want to go through the application, I usually kind of go through it step by step, just so that you know what to do. But it's fairly self-explanatory, so I can do this relatively quickly, and then if you guys have questions, we can certainly stop and sort of stay on any of the fields for longer. As I said before, there is an interactive version that's available online, and for that one, the table in the budget will total itself up and things like that, which probably isn't that big of an advantage these days, but you're welcome to use that if you want to, and then print it out. We do require hard copies for this. Unlike most of our other applications for the grant program, we like to have them as physical hard copies with any necessary attachments. And so no email stuff is accepted. I will say that's for the main application, which is due October 25th. Thank you.
Every October, so it didn't make it by October 25th, it went to the following.
Right. We don't accept any new applications after October 25th. And again, I'll cover this in a bit, but that's sort of our first deadline. And then we have a final deadline that's in November, because if we have questions about your application, what I typically do is review them all. If I need more information from you, or if, say you just couldn't get your contractor that you wanted to work with to get you a good estimate in time, so maybe your budget has a kind of a guess number in there, but you haven't provided the estimate for that yet. That extra month is for stuff like that, where you can sort of update answers, and those things I accept via email. Name and address, pretty straightforward. 4x6 photograph, you can include that digitally or sort of just tape it onto the application. For this one, we just really want it to be a representational photo. And then in addition to that, we're asking you to attach no more than 6 pages of good, clear, high-resolution photos that sort of document the conditions of the property vis-a-vis the work that you're proposing to do. So, you know, for this cover photo, we want to, this is actually the Burgess House in Hyattsville, as a matter of fact. We want to just sort of see what site is it. And then for the other images that go along with it, you know, if it's the windows, for example, which it was in this case, show us some details of the glazing putty failing and the paint failing or what have you. So that's when we'd want to see what the money would actually be going to address. And then in addition to the printed pages of photos, we also ask that you include a thumb drive or a CD of high-resolution digital copies of the photos so that we have those for our grant committee to look at. This is just where you put your amount requested, you know, not to exceed $50,000, and it should match the amount of your total grant request in the budget on the next
Do
page.
you have to have the contractor proposal?
We,
Do you have to justify the 50,000? You have to say.
yeah.
To Joe's gonna take 30,000 and to Bob, so you have to have that before October 31st?
You don't necessarily have to have that by the first deadline. If you have, you know, an idea of what it will cost, but you're still waiting to get your contractor estimates, you can supplement those later, even if it means updating your budget at that time. But you definitely need to have them for the final application, because that is something that the grant committee looks at, and they really like to see backup for, you know, the costs and stuff like that. They like to see good estimates. So, and you're welcome to change them. So if you have an estimate for the first deadline and then you get a better one that you like more, you can swap them out. You can update your budget. And if that happens even after the award has been done, you're not sort of married to the estimates that have come in. If you find another one in the intervening months where the easement's being negotiated and all that stuff, you can change contractors. So there is flexibility there. You're not completely locked into them. But we want to have at least something to say, yeah, okay, it's reasonable that this is going to cost $50,000. Applicant contact information, which is not necessarily the owner's contact information. Some people have a representative or someone that do this on their behalf, and that's totally fine. This is just for me to know who the best person to reach out with questions. When I give you feedback on the initial application, who should I send that to? Then they may be following up with the property owner, but again, it may not necessarily be the property owner. The project description, this is where you just sort of say what you're asking for funding for. You really do want to focus on the grant-funded work here. Keep it succinct. We want it to be pretty concise, but also to have enough detail that we know what we're doing. But in a lot of cases, the contractor estimates that you get will probably have a lot of that detail, so you don't usually need to go into too much of it here. The budget's really important. Again, this is where you're going to document what the project is going to cost, which may not necessarily be the same as what you're requesting for the grant. You know, if your project's a total exterior rehabilitation, for example, you may have a work item that's the windows, you may have a work item that's the roof, and you kind of want to keep these things as discreetly broken apart as you can, because if you do get less money than you ask for, it's sometimes helpful to just be able to say, well, then I'm not going to, you know, this won't be grant funded or that won't be grant funded.
Which
and
is
it's
not to say it might not be in 2 years, right?
Right, absolutely. We've had a number of properties. I think the most grants that any one property has gotten is like 4 or 5, and they've, you know, come back and done smaller things, and you know, it adds up and it keeps them moving along. So the first, let's see if the first column, the grant column, after you describe the work items, that's what you're actually requesting from us. So that total where the arrow points should be no more than $50,000. And then the next one here is the total project cost, and that can be, you know, an obscene amount of money. That could be, you know, a couple $100,000, and everything else in between there is either going to be cash, in kind, or donated material. So if you're getting a $50,000 grant on a $150,000 project, you might have $100,000 of your own cash going into it, or a couple $1,000s worth of in-kind labor from folks. This is just a quick example of you know, someone that's doing an exterior rehabilitation. They've got window repair and reglazing that's going to cost $11,000. So they're requesting 10 of that from the grant. They're going to put in, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, another $1,000 of that as their match, and that's so they're keeping it, they're 10% on each line item, and you don't necessarily have to do that. But in this case, that's what they're doing. Also, just to note, the property survey, if you're not a returning grant recipient, if you're coming to it for the first time, we will need a survey for the easement. So we encourage people to sort of include that in their budget if they can, because you can use the grant funds to pay for that survey, to have someone come out and do a survey of the property. So that can be
Would that
included.
be required in our case also?
We have a
If you have
survey
one,
sale.
yeah, if you have
From
one,
the sale
then you're
of the
probably
person,
fine.
yeah.
Where it really usually is important is if a property just hasn't had one in years,
Yeah.
hasn't changed hands, and we don't have a current one. But if you've got a current one, then that's fine. This is how we score the projects. I think this starts on page
3 of 6.
Yeah, so the next page of the application just sort of shows you how those 100 points come together. The ones that I'm going to show on the screen here that have a number associated with it, that number will associate to the question number in the thing. Some of them, which are outlined here, you as the applicant actually can't really address in your application. It's sort of out of your hands. So for like the equitable countywide distribution of funds, that really is where you are geographically in terms of a given year's applicants. So if everybody that applied in a given year is from Hyattsville, it's going to be really tight competition. But the one guy that's maybe down in Brandywine or what have you will get, maybe an extra couple of points in that. And it's not going to be enough to make or break it, but it helps us to make sure that the funding isn't just going to one community in a given year. And the same with neighborhood reinvestment areas. You're either in one of those or you're not. This is from a couple years ago. We had 20 applications that year, and as I sort of alluded to before, a lot of them were in the Hyattsville area to such an extent that we needed to do a sort of inset map to actually show them all. So the properties in Hyattsville that year, they got a lower score for the geographic distribution than.
Those are actually not reindeer and brown.
Right, yeah. I guess the sort of Route 1 area. Generally. And the TNI, which is the Transforming Neighborhoods Initiative area, those are shown in purple. That year we didn't have any that were in TNI areas. So if you're in one of those areas, you get, I guess it's maybe like a bonus 5 points. I guess just to jump back to this really quickly, historical and cultural significance, if I can scroll over here. So that's, if you're already a historic site, we've already written that up for you. You'll have that on your sort of one-page historic property summary sheet, and you can just literally copy and paste that right from there or from the MIHP form. It doesn't have to be much, it's like a paragraph or two. If you're not a historic site yet and you've got some interesting history that you know about the property, this is obviously when you request an evaluation to become a historic site, which you would need to do as some part of this process anyway, we would come up with that and we can help you find it then. But you'll have to have something for this before that if you don't have it already. And if you are watching this and are a historic site and don't have that form in front of you, reach out to me, let me know. I can provide you with the information for this field. Urgency of need for financial assistance. This isn't necessarily meant to address, someone's personal financial situation, which the planning board is forbidden from evaluating in this process, but it's more or less, is there a wrecking ball looming at the property? Is there a unique opportunity to sort of combine this grant with other financial incentives to address an issue at the property? So it's more about that than do you really need money to do this project, because we don't take that into consideration. The funding, the retention of historically significant material or details, that can be worth up to 15 points. It's something that we really encourage, and it can really help a project score well overall if you're retaining historically significant material or details. However, that's not always possible, and there are some projects that are perfectly acceptable, that meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, that are grant fundable, that just, aren't really about retaining material. You might be putting a new roof on a property and that's fine. You might need to, I don't know, do foundation work, which I guess something like that, you're inherently preserving the whole property by addressing that. But all that is to say that, if your property isn't necessarily about that, that's okay. But if you can highlight anything like that, so if you are doing foundation work, just sort of point out what may seem like it's obvious, that fixing the foundation of the house maybe isn't quite as dramatic and appealing of a project as tediously repairing all of the original woodwork, but it's ultimately going to keep that property there for longer. So there's always retention of historically significant material or details. You just want to really highlight that in your application. Number 10 is the provision for long-term resource preservation. This is sort of how much of this project is going to lead, and a lot of these can overlap with each other. So like number 9, if you're doing foundation work, that's also going to be long-term resource preservation because it's going to keep your house from collapsing to the ground. Same thing with a roof, same thing with windows, anything on the building envelope is pretty critical for long-term resource preservation. But you just, again, you want to highlight how your proposal is addressing that. Even if it seems obvious, it's really good to have sort of compelling language for the grant committee and people that are reviewing these. Number 11 is the extent to which the project could stimulate other preservation activities. This is probably the hardest question to answer. It's a lot more maybe touchy-feely than some of these other ones where it's, I'm putting a roof on. Of course, it's long-term preservation. So, it's something we can work on.
County or community. So how is my working on my home going to influence all of my neighbors around me?
What we typically, sort of tell people is that, at least in theory, the more people that participate in this grant program and are doing sort of visible preservation work, maybe your neighbors will see it and say, oh, you're really improving your... Yeah, and so, but again, it's very hard to really know that that's happening. So number 12 is your readiness to initiate and complete the project. Did you have contractors lined up? Do you have good estimates? Do you sort of have a plan to do this? Do you know, you're going to get the money by maybe May or June of the following year, and you're going to be ready to pull the trigger and move forward? And again, that can be hard to gauge, but the more prepared and more well put together your application is, generally the more it's going to look like you're ready to initiate and complete the project. So that sort of overlaps with administrative capability. Do you have a well put together application? Do you seem to be addressing the goals of the program in your application's other answers? Because oftentimes that's the only way we can gauge the administrative capability. Certainly if you're part of an organization, or if you're a municipality that's applying for this, you're probably going to have a pretty high administrative capability score because there will probably be staff that are working on your grant application. But even for an individual property owner, if you can get, working with me, we can get you a good application put together that's, clear, concise, and compelling, which are my 3 C's for filling out your grant application. I apologize for having a corny thing like that, but if you can put together something like that, then you're probably going to get a pretty good administrative capability.
Concise, I mean, one of the things is, how can you fit all of your estimates, your letter, and description, and all of your
So you can have attachments. You can definitely attachments. That's right. We've had people that have done that where it's like, microscopic, and I've actually then sent it back to them for the final and said, please don't do that. Just keep it brief, and then, if you've got estimates, then those are probably going to say what the person's proposing. Oh, I'm going to scrape off the paint, I'm going to do epoxy repairs to the wood, and then I'm going to repaint it and reglaze, or what, I go back to windows a lot, but that's where we'll see all that. So you don't necessarily have to write it all out in that description of work, and you do want to kind of keep it again, because again, if the grant committee that's reviewing these initially is looking at 20 of these applications, and trying to remember what each one of them said, so that they can kind of compare them mentally before going into the committee meeting. It's very helpful for them to have these sort of compelling, clear, and concise points. So they'll say, yes, that was the one that's doing X, Y, and Z, and that's the little yellow house that they're doing this thing. And, just because of human nature and the way our brains are. It's just hard to keep that much information straight. So, not that they don't care, not that they're not interested and not going to be trying to really think about each individual project, but just to sort of, make it a little easier and more bearable for them. 14 is demonstrated community interest and support. The way that this is shown in the application is we ask you to submit letters from the community, up to 5, preferably no fewer than 3, but quality over quantity certainly. So that could be from your elected representatives, whether that's maybe the mayor of your community or your council person, someone from the Prince George's County Historical and Cultural Trust, or something like that, an organization. It can be neighbors and stuff too, but certainly if you can get some of those bigger names on there, that can look pretty good for showing that there's community interest and support. So that's something to definitely start pursuing early, because it can take a while to get a response from elected officials and people like that. The next section is the property owner certification. So this is where, if you're a person filling out an application on someone's behalf, and the applicant is different than the owner, you would have the property owner sign here so that we know that they know that you're applying for a grant for their property, because ultimately they're going to have to be the ones that sign the easement, because you can't sign the easement for someone else's property. So it's good that they know about this early on, because you don't want to go through the process and then have it not go anywhere because you can't get the property owner to agree to the easement, or something like that. So they'll sign here. If there are multiple property owners, there's a separate section for a separate second property owner. And then there's also a section below that, number 16, which is for a corporate resolution if it's owned by an organization instead of individual property owners. So, pretty cut and dry stuff there. This is just some quick examples, which I'll blow through very quickly, of properties that have come back for grant funding, or that have received grant funding rather. The Black Swamp School in Brandywine. You can see the before photo and after. They did pretty extensive stuff. They even removed a later addition at the rear of the property that was not historic. This next one is the Oatlands property in Laurel. It's one of the properties that's associated with the Snowden family up in Laurel, along with Snow Hill Manor and Montpelier up there. And it's still an ongoing project. They've got a lot of work that still needs to be done, but you can see between 2003 and 2014, after a couple of grants, they did a lot of repointing work on the masonry, lots of window repair and slate roof repair has gone into that property. And again, it's still ongoing. They may apply for another grant this year. I don't remember when their last one was from. This is Perkins Chapel, which is over in Glendale, Maryland. It's a small chapel that's used just a few times a year for gatherings for a larger parish. And they had, over a series of years, restored the siding, scraped the wood completely off with infrared heat down to the bare wood, and then repaired the siding underneath. Repaired the windows in a similar way, just fully removing the paint, and then they put on a new roof. And this isn't even the final photo. It looks even better now, actually, but that's from 2017, when I think they had spent the last of their grant funds, maybe. And then they kind of continued just finishing up other things. This is probably one of the most dramatic ones. This is the Claggett House in Upper Marlboro in Cool Spring Manor. These property owners, I just met with them a while ago, and they've done some really incredible work on the exterior and interior of the property. Just about everything has been done on this property at this point. I don't know how many grants they've gotten, but suffice to say that in the little $50,000 increments, it's barely even a portion of the total amount of money and time that's been spent on the property. But it really is kind of one of our great success stories of the grant program. They've done masonry work, they've rebuilt the porches basically from the ground up, new piers, new porch structure, and then floorboards that matched either what we know was there or what was likely to have been there based on the age of the property. They've done a lot of interior work.
The front door completely.
Yeah, because it was originally a center hall plan and it had been moved at a later date, kind of similar to Bostwick actually. And they put it back where it was, restored the symmetrical facade. It's kind of the same on both sides. So when you open those doors up, it's just a beautiful breezeway straight down the hallway, and it's really something. And they, like I said, they've been able to come back and kind of do incremental projects, and they're out there for a couple months a year working on it, and yeah, it's pretty great. This is the timeline that you were asking about before. So the applications come in October. You guys have until November to work on them and finalize them with assistance from me. And then I've got them, I collate them, I give them to the grant committee, which is composed of staff from the planning department and then members of the Historic Preservation Commission. They usually review them in January or February. I always try to do it as early as possible. So probably in January they'll be reviewing them, and they're the body. So I review them all too, obviously, but I have no power to score them or to award any money. So the grant committee does the initial scoring in January, February. They then pass their recommendations on to the Historic Preservation Commission. So some of the people on the commission will have already seen them as part of the grant committee. The full Historic Preservation Commission then looks at those recommendations, they look at the applications, and then they either make their own recommendations or they pass on the recommendations of the grant committee to the planning board. And we, it's a little less certain as to when we are on their agenda, but usually sometime in March or April we get on the planning board's agenda. And then, as I said before, they're the ultimate, it's their funding, they're the ultimate decision maker in the process, so they will look at the recommendations of the Historic Preservation Commission as presented to them by staff, and they'll ask questions. And at both the Historic Preservation Commission meeting in February and the Planning Board meeting in March or April, all of the applicants and just members of the public in general will have the opportunity to come out and speak about the project. It can take some time to actually get started on the work.
So if you get a contractor that gives you estimates,
Yeah, they should.
and a year goes by, it's okay to get a different contractor?
It is, yeah.
So the initial contractor estimates doesn't really matter whether you're really happy with that contractor or not. As long as you have an estimate for the application, then you've got a whole year to find the contractor you want.
Yeah, so, and certainly, we would encourage people to look for someone good to begin with.
Yeah,
But
that's what I was saying.
but yeah, if you find someone better,
Because finding a really good contractor can be a long process.
Sure,
So
sure.
doing it between now and it's already September almost.
Yeah,
Between
yeah.
now and October 25th is a pretty steep climb.
yeah,
But
definitely.
what you're saying is get a reliable contractor to have them give you an estimate,
Yeah, just so you have
you
something
submit it.
realistic.
and then you have another year. to-
Even that first step can take.
Yeah.
I understand, but
Yeah.
that's that's really good news, because the pressure seems too steep to get up
Right.
between, okay, good.
So yeah, this timeline is good to keep in mind. It can be several months before you can actually start doing work. Sometimes things happen that you may end up needing to actually decline your grant award and take yourself out of the running after you've already been awarded it, and that's fine too. That does happen year to year. And even after you've signed the contract, you still will have the opportunity to do that. You're not going to be forced to sign the easement. We definitely don't want to do that. We want it to be something that people are comfortable doing. But this is good to keep in mind also. If you've got something in mind for this year, but maybe it's a bigger project, this timeline is good to keep in mind, because the grant program is kind of a more long-term planning thing compared to some other. You can come in and get an HAWP turned around in a couple of weeks or a month and do work right away if it isn't grant funded. And we do have a tax credit program that can be really good for stuff like that, that's really pressing, that can't wait until May or June or July or August to start working on. But if you're
The tax credit, 20% tax credit, that's totally separate from this, you can do that.
It
on
is.
this very same project?
If you did it on the same project, yes and no. I mean, no in the sense that if the money that's paying for the work is coming from the planning board, we can't then give you a tax credit for it. If it's a larger project where we're paying for a portion of it, so if you've got like a $200,000 project or something like that, and you got 50 from us, that other 150 you could,
Okay, that's,
or I guess 145, because the match would be included in that. But you could do that. You can definitely do that, and people have done that recently, and it's not a problem. So we do try to help people bundle the incentives to the extent that it's possible and ethical to do so. So we're a little bit over time, and we haven't even talked about the easement really too much, although I guess we did ask some questions about it. So very quickly, just to restate this, the preservation easement is a voluntary private legal agreement wherein a property owner, which is the grantor in this case, transfers certain property rights to a qualified easement holding organization, which would be us, the grantee, Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, via a deed or other document that has binding and enforceable covenants and is recorded in the land records for the property in perpetuity, continuing on to subsequent property owners. So that's really the sort of, in a nutshell, what the easement is, how it's different from the historic site designation, which also is there for the foreseeable future but could be changed by the changing of legislation. The easement really is not affected by that because it's ultimately a private agreement between entities. Just to try to visualize it, I made this graphic a couple years ago, and I don't know if it does more harm than good, but you may have a property that has multiple structures. Maybe you've got a shed or some other outbuilding that is not historic. When the easement's drawn up, this is just to show that we can sort of customize it to the property. So in this case, this is supposed to be sort of an orthogonal view of a plat, a site, and you've got a building on it that's in that dark gray. That's your historic structure. The whole property is the green rectangle that's sort of bent. And then there's a non-historic structure that's the little blue rectangle. The easement can carve out those non-historic structures by name, because when we get that site survey done, if they're labeled or whatever, we can call them out and say, that the easement specifically excludes this chicken coop or this shed or this garage building. And that's something we can work on with you on a case-by-case basis, because it may not be in our interest to have to be obligated year after year to inspect these non-historic property elements as well. So just to give you an idea of that. Just very quickly again, the preservation easement obligates the property owner and subsequent owners to refrain from certain actions, for example demolition, and to seek approval from MNC-PPC for other actions, for example changing the exterior appearance of the property, constructing an addition. It does not constitute an ownership interest in the property by MNC-PPC. It is required as a condition of receiving a grant award through this program. And it does require routine, generally annual monitoring of the property to ensure adherence with the terms of the easement. And it provides the property owner and subsequent owners with technical assistance from staff. So you can come to us as when you have a project that you're thinking of doing to get our opinion. We can come out to the property and try to help you figure things out. And that's kind of the easement in a nutshell. It is a complicated topic. It's a legally binding agreement. So it's definitely something that you want to read through the sample document. If you have an attorney, we encourage you to meet with them about it early and often. We'll give you the opportunity once we have a draft easement for your specific property to review it with an attorney before signing it. Obviously, but even if you can show them the sample and get their 2 cents on that, see if it's something you're comfortable with, because it is required. So if it's not something you're comfortable with, we do have other incentives like the tax credit that don't involve an easement for historic site owners.
The restrictions on a plat house?
They're not necessarily more severe, but they are deeded and it's private. So it's recorded in the land records in a way that the historic site designation is not. The historic site designation is also ostensibly permanent, but it's enabled by Subtitle 29 of the County Code of Ordinances. So theoretically, if the county council ever decided to do this, they could change the legislation that enables Subtitle 29, which is the Historic Preservation Ordinance. And in that hypothetical situation, you could have a sort of on-the-ground reality where we no longer have designated historic sites in the county and there's no regulation. In that case, the easements would still stand because they're this private agreement. So they're not necessarily more restrictive, but they are at least theoretically much more permanent.
For any project that you're trying to do with a grant money, you can't actually break ground on it until all of that
Until all of that's done.
resolved.
Right, because the easement has to be recorded before we start releasing grant funds. And then really quickly, this is my last slide. Sorry for staying a little bit longer. We do have a non-capital grant program, which I mentioned before, probably more interesting to municipalities and organizations than individual property owners, but certainly individual property owners, if you have a project in mind, you can apply. It's, again, not brick and mortar work. It's preparation of plans, reports, architectural designs, specifications, etc., educational stuff. And individuals that reside in the county, nonprofits that are based in the county or that are statewide but doing a project in the county, and political subdivisions that are in the county can apply. You know, if you're an organization seeking funding, you have to be sort of a preservation or history focused organization. And that's sort of it. It has a 50% match for grants over $5,000. If your grant is $5,000 or less, there is no match requirement. So you can do some pretty interesting stuff within that range that doesn't require any of your own money to be expended.
Are these tied to the easement as well?
No easements with these because they're not necessarily tied to a property. They can be, you could be someone that's just doing research in the county. You could be doing a archaeological survey. I say archaeological survey, so it's important to note that if you're a developer who's doing archaeology for regulatory compliance reasons, you cannot take advantage of this program. So if it's anything like that, you can't. But if you're just doing research for other reasons, you can. And for that 50% match, we haven't been completely clear about this, so we've had some confusion even with people who have gotten these awards. It's only on any money over the $5,000. So if you've got a project and you can't get it under $5,000 because it goes over and costs $5,001, you don't then have to have a 50% match. You would only have to match for 50 cents on that extra dollar. So if you go up to the $25,000, which is the maximum grant amount, which is not on this slide, but the most you can get through this program is $25,000, you would only have to match the $20,000. So you'd have to come up with 10 of your own for a total of a $35,000 project. So it's a fairly generous program as well if you have things that are interested, or if you know of organizations that might want to take advantage of this, please spread the word. And for more information on either of our grant programs, you can visit pgplanning.org/466/grants.